Hi, boys and girls. Today I'm going to read Chapter 3 of Frindle by Andrew Clements. Chapter 3 is called The Question. See? The Question. So, Chapter 1 was called Nick, when we met Nick. Chapter 2 was called Mrs. Granger. We met Mrs. Granger. And now Chapter 3, it's called The Question. So, of course I'm wondering, why is it called The Question? You should be thinking the same thing. The question, and you should have a question about it. The question. So let's read chapter 3, the question, and let's find out what's happening here. The first day of school was always getting acquainted day. Books were passed out, and there was a lot of chatter. Everyone asked, "What did you do over the summer?" So it's kind of like the first day of school, right? You getting to know your friends and who was their teacher last year. Just kind of like when you started in 3rd grade in my class and you were thinking, you were meeting with your friends, and then start thinking about when you go to 4th grade this school year and you're gonna meet your friends. Periods 1 through 6 went by very smoothly for Nick. But then came period 7. Mrs. Granger's class was all business. So remember that in this school, 5th grade is getting them ready to go to middle school, and in middle school they have periods, period 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. And so in 5th grade they're getting them used to it, and so they have different classes with different teachers, as we read in yesterday's chapter. The first thing they did was take a vocabulary pretest to see how many of the 35 words for the week the kids already knew. Tremble, circular, orchestra, the list went on and on. Nick knew most of them. You see, Mrs. Granger was not wasting any time. She wasn't getting the kids getting acquainted. She was all business, like, let's get started right away. Don't waste any time. Then there was a handout about class procedures. After that, there was a review paper about cursive writing. And then there was a sample sheet showing how the heading should look on every assignment. No let up for 35 minutes straight. Mrs. Granger, she wasn't wasting any time. She was all business. She was telling them all the expectations in her class. Nick was an expert at asking that delaying question. He was also known as the teacher stopper, or the guaranteed time waster. At 3 minutes before the bell, in the split second between the end of today's class work and the announcement of tomorrow's homework, Nick could launch a question guaranteed to sidetrack the teacher long enough to delay or even wipe out the homework assignment. So that is his thing. He likes to stop the teacher so that she won't give any homework. That was smart of him. Timing was important. But asking the right question, that was the hard part. Questions about stuff in the news, questions about the college the teacher went on, questions about the teacher's favorite book, or their favorite sport, or their favorite hobby. Nick knew all the tricks, and he had been very successful in the past. Here he was in 5th grade, near the end of his very first language arts class with Mrs. Granger. And Nick could feel a homework assignment coming the way a farmer can feel a rainstorm. This is important. I'm going to reread this little paragraph again because you need to know what kind of a student Nick is. It says, here he was in 5th grade, near the end of his very first language arts class with Mrs. Granger. And Nick could feel a homework assignment coming the way a farmer can feel a rainstorm. So he knew that Mrs. Granger was getting ready to give the homework, and he didn't want any homework. So he was gonna figure out a way so that Mrs. Granger wouldn't give him any homework, or the class. Mrs. Granger paused to catch her breath, and Nick's hand shot up. He raised his hand. She glanced down at her seating chart and then up at him. Her sharp gray eyes were not even turned up to half power. "Yes, Nicholas?" Well, you know his name is Nicholas, so Nick is for short. Mrs. Granger, you have so many dictionaries in this room, and that huge one especially. Where did all those words come from? Did they just get copied from other dictionaries? It sure is a big book. You see what he's doing? So let me reread that again. It says, Mrs. Granger, you have so many dictionaries in this room, and that huge one especially. Where did all of those words come from? Did they just get copied from other dictionaries? It sure is a big book. It was perfect, thought Grenade. Kapow! Several kids smiled, and a few peeked at the clock. Nick was famous for this, and the whole class knew what he was doing. Uh-oh. Do you think this is going to work? Do you think Mrs. Granger is going to fall for his trick? Think about it. Unfortunately, so did Mrs. Granger. She hesitated a moment and gave Nick a smile that was just a little too sweet to be real. Her eyes were the color of a thundercloud. Well, why? What an interesting question, Nicholas. I could talk about that for hours. I bet. She glanced around the classroom to look at all the kids. Do the rest of you want to know too? Everyone nodded. Yes. Very well then. Nicholas, will you do some research on that subject and give a little oral report to the class? If you find out the answer yourself, it will mean so much more than if I just told you. Please have your report ready for our class, for our next class. Uh-oh, you see what happened? His plan backfired. Do you know why? Think about it for a moment. So Nicholas is trying to get Mrs. Granger not to give homework, but instead she gave him a homework. She said, if you want to know, why don't you go find out? Because if you find out the answer yourself, it will mean so much more than if I just told you. Please have your report ready for our next class. Mrs. Granger smiled at him again, kind of like a got you smile. Very sweetly though. She's like, Then it was back to business. See, Mrs. Granger is all about business. She's very stern. She's not a new teacher. She's been teaching for a while now. Now, boys and girls, the homework. The homework for tomorrow can be found on page 12 of your Words Alive book. Nick barely heard the assignment. His heart was pounding, and he felt small, very small. That means he was embarrassed. He could feel the top of his ears glowing red. A complete shutdown. An extra assignment? And probably a little black mark next to his name on the seating chart? Everything he had heard about this teacher was true. Don't mess around with the Lone Ranger. So that's the end of chapter 2. And so now, now I know why the chapter was called The Question. Do you know why the chapter was called The Question? Remember, Nick had a question that he thought that it was gonna make Mrs. Granger, stop him from getting homework. But instead of having one homework, he now has 2 homeworks. And Mrs. Granger said, I'm not gonna give you the answer. It's better if you find the answer. So now Nick has to go do 2 homeworks instead of 1. And so that's why the question was, Nick had a question to the teacher, but the teacher said, you go look and find the answer. So that's the end of this chapter. Bye, boys and girls. Don't forget to answer the questions. And if you have any questions, just send me a message